My name is Adam Goddard, and I don't have a degree in anything. I do, though, have a great interest in military history, specifically the fall of France in 1940 and the Battle of Britain. In 1990, at the age of 19, and looking a bit of a geek, I joined the Royal Air Force. This fulfilled the dream that I had had since I was about 4 years old. It seemed only fitting, since both my grandfathers, and I think all my great-grandfathers, had seen military service. I had a blast flying some jet trainers and then operationally the Wessex and Chinook helicopters. My liver didn't appreciate the 11 years, but it was an incredible time, and I wouldn't change it, even if I had the chance. I then moved to Canada, and being older, calmer, and allegedly wiser, I fly the Q400 for a Canadian airline. This gives me the time to pursue my history projects, and more importantly, pay for them. It's been said that if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, history will just repeat itself. Battlefield Ancestors is just a tiny footstep in the path mankind has trodden through countless wars. I hope it might be used as a lesson for present and future generations, so that we never repeat the carnage of the first half of the 20th century. In the early 1980s, when I was perhaps 12 years old, I was on the south coast of England, and I was crossing the road to meet back up with my grandmother. When I got to her, she was in tears. I asked her what the problem was, and she said that when she saw me crossing the road, she thought I was perhaps her brother. The only problem was, her brother died over 40 years earlier in France at the beginning of the Second World War. This was my first introduction to her brother, Walter Messenger. He would have been my great uncle. I wanted to find out more about him, and I wanted to honour what he did in the Second World War. I have found out a lot more about him. I'm going to show it to you all over the next half an hour. And I think I found out more than even perhaps his family knew at the time of his death. A lot of this video wouldn't have been possible without the help of Ray Goodacre, a man who I now call my friend. He wrote a book called The Story of the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment. For anybody interested, it is a good read. He has a wealth of information, and I'm very happy that he decided to share that information with me. So I've got all my bags ready. I'm going to leave Calgary, head to Paris. Whilst I'm travelling, I'm going to give you a short history of Walter Messenger, who he was, where he grew up, and then I'll tell you the story about what he did in France. Walter Henry Messenger was born in Wareham, Dorset, just 3 months before the end of World War I, on the 14th of August 1918. His father, my great-grandfather, was also Walter Messenger, and at this time he was a senior NCO in the Royal Tank Corps, presumably based in Devon. His mother, my great-grandmother, was Dorothy Messenger, formerly Dorothy Wilmot. She was what we would call today a stay-at-home mum as far as I know. At some point, Walter was nicknamed Sonny, I assume to avoid confusion with his father. In this picture, you can see Sonny in about 1923, along with the rest of his family, now including his sister, my grandmother, Betty Messenger. Being part of an army family, Sonny was moved around the country a fair bit whilst growing up. This photo was taken in a studio on the high street of Kirkcaldy, Scotland, around 1927, when his father was based up there. In 1931, the Messenger family was living in Queen Elizabeth Street, London, which is just south of Tower Bridge. In the mid-1930s, they moved to 29 Muschamp Road, which is in between Peckham and Dulwich. And in fact, my great-grandmother lived there until the late 1960s. Here you can see what 29 Muschamp Road looks like today. I love this photo. It's from a scout camp, probably around 1933, and both of them looked so happy. They're even playing to the camera by leaning to one side to perhaps try and confuse the photographer. To me, this photo shows the bond that can only exist between father and son. This is the first photo I can show you of an adult Sonny. I guess it was taken in either 1937 or perhaps 1938. War clouds were starting to form in Europe. Little did he and his family know how their world was shortly going to be turned upside down. Whilst waiting to join the Metropolitan Police Force, Sonny was conscripted into the army in the spring of 1939, sometime after the Military Training Act was passed in government in April 1939. He was just 20 years old. These first conscripts were known as militiamen, so they could be distinguished from the regulars. He expressed an interest in following in his father's footsteps and joining the Royal Tank Corps, but having a rather dry sense of humour, the army assigned him to an anti-tank unit, the 57th East Surrey Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery, to give it its full name. This photo has been colorised by me, and I hope it's done him justice. It's the only colour photo that exists of him, and the only one of him in uniform. It was probably taken in 1939, and as far as I know, it's the last photo of him. In October 1939, the regiment was moved down to Shard in Somerset, where it took part in lots of training and exercises in preparation for the expected war. In April 1940, the regiment was still billeted in and around Chard when the order to move to France arrived. Let's turn now to the equipment Sonny was operating. The regiment was fully mechanised, with a mix of Bedford and Morris 1500 weight or 3/4 ton trucks towing the 2-pound anti-tank gun. The gun itself was operated by a 3-man team. Ideally, there were another 2 men assigned who provided ammunition and another chap to drive the truck. The 3-man team was made up of the number 1, who was a sergeant or corporal in charge of the gun, a number 2, who loaded and unloaded the gun, and a number 3, who aimed the gun according to the number 1's instructions and fired the gun. Sonny was the number 3 man. So in this video, Sonny would be the chap who is seated. He is moving the gun by turning the wheels in front of him and aiming through the basic optical sight. You can clearly see the number 2 load the gun. Number 3 fires, the empty case is automatically ejected, and the number 2 reloads the gun. All the while, number 1 is crouched behind the layer, issuing instructions to his gun team. The 2-pounder was designed to take out tanks and other armoured vehicles, and in 1940 it was capable of doing that. All it really was a scaled-up rifle, in this case firing a hefty piece of metal ballistically at the enemy. In theory, it could engage a target out at 2,000 yards, which for the youth of today is just under 2 kilometres. However, the preferred shooting range was about 800 yards, or 3/4 of a kilometre. A well-trained crew could accurately fire about 12 rounds a minute, or for the mathematically challenged, 1 shot every 5 seconds. When ordered to fire, Sonny used a foot pedal to shoot the gun. If that failed, there was a secondary hand-operated trigger to his right, and in an emergency, the gun could be fired by a mechanism on the back of the breech. Having arrived in France, it just remains to meet my special guest, my mum, Sonny's niece. On the afternoon of the 8th of April 1940, Sonny and the rest of the regiment left Southampton docks. They waited in the Solent for darkness and a Royal Navy escort before proceeding across the Channel by night. They sailed on the SS Louth, a British and Irish cross-channel passenger ferry. Interestingly, she survived the war, was renamed the Ulster Duke, but sank under tow in the Bay of Biscay in 1951. In the early hours of the 9th of April, they arrived in the port of Cherbourg, France. Later on that afternoon, Sonny and the regiment boarded a train and steamed through the night. They stopped in Caen at midnight, where they received hot tea and had a chance to stretch their legs. At 6 a.m. on the 10th of April, they arrived at La Hutte, just north of Le Mans, where they met up with the regimental transport that had travelled over by road. They spent a couple of days in the area before setting off in a 124-vehicle convoy, which occupied an incredible 12 miles of road. They convoyed for a couple of days, crossing the River Seine at Vernon, and then on to Preselles, near Amiens, where they spent 5 days billeted in a convent of all places. On the 24th of April, they left Preselles, passed through Amiens, and after 250 miles arrived in Le Douillet on the Belgian border. Sonny spent 2 weeks in the area, training, servicing equipment, and on the dreaded cross-country runs. On the 9th of May, anti-aircraft fire could be heard to the east. In the early hours of the 10th of May, Sonny would have been woken by the air raid warning siren. He would have seen flashes of bomb detonations in the Lille area and the drone of aircraft overhead. For Sonny, this would have been the first sights and sounds of war he experienced. For him and the rest of the regiment, the war was about to turn hot. Although he wouldn't have known it, the air raids he witnessed were the beginnings of the Germans' Western campaign. That morning, the 10th of May, at 8 a.m, the regiment was put on 6 hours' notice to move. Sonny and 225 Battery spent the morning busily getting ready. Live ammunition was issued, and after lunch they set off for the start point. The regiment was told to cross into Belgium at 4 p.m. on the 10th of May at Romarin, just north of Nieppe. And this is Romarin. On the 10th of May 1940, this is where the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment crossed from France into Belgium. The border post was right here. And what's so great about this is I actually know Sonny was right here at this spot. 4 p.m. was their start time. That was when they were told to cross the border, and they crossed at 4 p.m. exactly. They got a little bit of hassle off the border guards who didn't know anything about them being allowed into Belgium. So being the British Army, they just pushed over the border post and rolled straight through. And they were into Belgium and on their way. After blowing through the French-Belgian border at Romarin, their next stop was here in Vervik, Belgium, right on the river. They were travelling in radio silence to keep the whole movement a surprise from the Germans, but unfortunately, the local churches, this one included, decided to ring all their bells in glorious celebration of the arrival of the British Army. The cat was out of the bag. Early on the 11th of May, the regiment passed Menin and continued on to Kortrijk, where they received an enthusiastic welcome from the locals. They continued on to Zvergem, where regimental HQ was established in the Café Bacchus early on the 12th of May. On the afternoon of the 12th of May, the regiment arrived at Castor, near the vital bridge over the river Escaut at Kerkhove. All was quiet for now, but sometime around mid-May, 225 Battery, along with Sonny, were ordered to dig in at Petegem, Belgium. This is the view from the church tower in Petegem. I assume the British had a spotter up here to watch over the river. Sonny and 225 Battery probably moved here on the 18th of May and prepared their gun positions. On May 19th, there was increased German air activity and bombing a few miles to the east at Wiedenard. Let's switch sides now and take a look at the Germans and their weaponry. The troops who attacked Sonny on the 27th of May 1940 were the De Fuhrer Regiment of the SS Verfungung Division. Their Verfungung Division was created in 1934 as combat troops for the Nazi Party. The De Fuhrer Regiment was created in 1938 in Vienna after the annexation of Austria, and was made up largely of Austrian volunteers. The regiment was an infantry regiment and contained 3 infantry battalions, along with a reconnaissance battalion, signals unit, artillery unit, and support personnel. They were considered the creme de la creme of the German infantry, and by the spring of 1940 they had been attached to the main German army and were ready for battle. They were a formidable opponent, and not to be underestimated in the slightest. In this clip, we have a German soldier operating the MG-34 machine gun as part of a reenactment. On the day of the battle, this gun would have been used to suppress the British forces in the forest, and it definitely would have been used against the 2-pound anti-tank gun, as the Germans wanted those silenced quickly. Air-cooled, recoil-operated, and belt-fed, it was capable of laying down 800 rounds a minute. Just think about that for a moment. That's 15 bullets coming at you every second. In 1940, it was arguably the best machine gun in the world, and Sonny was on the receiving end of it. That night, the regiment's commanding officer gave the ominous order that the regiment would fight to the last round and the last man. The following morning, the 20th of May, the battle commenced. The Germans were on the south side of the river Escaut. Sonny and the rest of his gun team in 225 Battery were on the north side of the river. The theory was that perhaps the Germans could be contained on the south side of the river, perhaps giving the Allies a chance to attack their positions and perhaps even push them back. The battle commenced on the 20th of May, and 225 Battery was in the thick of it from the get-go. This would have been Sonny's battle baptism, and one can only imagine how scared and yet excited he must have been. I think they all would have realised pretty quickly just how powerful the German army was, and that this was the real deal. They were fighting for their lives. Sonny and the rest of 225 Battery were positioned just north of Petegem, on the rising ground overlooking the village and the river valley, perhaps within meters of where I stand filming this. The battle continued for 3 days, but on the 22nd of May, the order was given at 11 p.m. to withdraw and move west back towards France. The German army was just too powerful. After being given the order to evacuate at 11 p.m. on the 22nd of May. The 57th Anti-Tank Regiment were given the job of defending the bridges over the River Lees in the Menin area. And I'm here at one of the handful of bridges over the river. We don't know which one Sonny and his gun were at. It could have been this one right behind me. They weren't here for very long. By late morning on the 23rd of May, they were told to leave this position and make their way back towards France. At this point, after the battle, the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment had lost 17 out of a total of 48 guns. And they hadn't even seen a single tank, let alone take a shot at a tank. All the guns lost, 17 in total, had in fact simply been overrun by German infantry. On Sunday the 26th of May 1940, 57th Anti-Tank Regiment and therefore 225 Battery and Sonny were ordered into the forest of Nieppe in preparation for the expected German attack the following morning. Now the regimental diaries simply aren't accurate enough to show us exactly where Sonny's gun was positioned, but it had to have been in the tree line you can see behind me so that they could look out across the fields ready for the Germans as they tried to sweep across it. Okay, here we are at the very end of the east-west track that runs through the forest of Nieppe, the very southwest corner, which is where we know Sonny was positioned. You can see behind me the track goes about another 100 meters, then there's a few trees, and then beyond that are the fields that lead to the village of Tannay. And it's from Tannay and across those fields that the Germans came that morning. The guns would have been towed in down the track behind you. They would have unhooked the guns, maneuvered them into position along the edge of the forest, and then they would have parked their vehicles here strategically so that they could make a hasty escape if they needed to. Responsibility for the defense of this area was the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment, specifically 225 Battery, which Sonny was a member of, and also the infantry of the 5th Royal West Kent. So let's head into the forest, see if we can find any evidence of the battle that took place here. Much excitement this morning. I'm in what looks like perhaps an infantry foxhole. A soldier would have dug this to give himself a little bit of protection from splinters and flying rounds. But whilst in here, I was waving around the little lightweight metal detector, and I got my one and only hit of the whole time I've been here. I had a little dig round and uncovered a little piece of barbed wire. It's buried in the ground. It's about 8 to 10 inches below the layer of the forest, so it could have been there sometime. I'm going to take a picture of it, compare it to some pictures of 1940 British barbed wire, and see if it's a match. Unfortunately, the forest here has been changed since the battle. Every part of it's been logged at least once. There's rubbish everywhere, evidence of mankind working in here, bottles, there's shotgun shells, there's garbage, there's everything. So nothing is the same as it was in 1940. But this hole looks too regular to be a coincidence. It's the correct size to get into. A little bit of barbed wire supports the fact that maybe someone was in here. So I think this is it. This is the sum total of what I can find that's left over from the battle. There are plenty of craters in the forest. Some are from artillery rounds in the 1940 battle, and some are from Allied bombing raids later on in the war. I'm standing here at the very northwest corner of the forest de Nieppe. To your left runs a little track and the canal, all the way past the forest to the main north-south road that runs through the middle of the forest. Behind me is the tree line that 225 Battery occupied in preparation for the German attack. And you can see just down here is a little cemetery. It's a First World War cemetery. It was here in 1940, obviously. Let's head down there, see if we can find any evidence of the battle that took place. Although the cemetery was here in 1940, it would have looked a little different than it does today. The main wall around the cemetery wasn't built until the 1950s, so the cross behind me and also the grave markers would have been exposed to the elements during the battle in 1940. If we take a look at the cross behind me, quite a good nick out of the corner of the masonry here. There's been a big patch to it here. Something's gone on here as well, and then just above it there's another sort of bit of patchwork as well. So I think this is the first evidence we've got of the battle that took place here in 1940.
As I'm looking at these headstones, I just saw this little round thing glinting up, which if I remove it, it's quite heavy, feels like lead. No real idea what it is, but it could well be a little musket bullet. Not sure, which could easily have worked its way up in the soil, but what period it belongs to, I don't know.
After a little bit of research, we discovered that the ball was actually from the First World War and over 100 years old. It would have been packed into a high explosive shell along with many others, fired at the enemy infantry, causing utter carnage when it exploded. Let's talk about the events of the morning of the 27th of May, 1940. In the forest was the British Expeditionary Force, the 5th Royal West Kent Infantry Battalion, and also the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment, specifically Sonny, his gun team, and 225 Battery. Stand 2 would have been about 4 o'clock in the morning. Every man in the forest would have moved into their fighting positions, ready to repel any German surprise attack at the crack of dawn. When this didn't happen, they would have started to get themselves ready for the day ahead. One of them perhaps would have made breakfast for the others. They would have cleaned their weapons, checked their main 2-pound gun, checked ammunition supplies. If they were lucky enough to have their Bren gun, a 2-man Bren gun team, they would have done exactly the same thing right next to the 2-pound gun as well. The Germans, behind the camera at this point, about 2 kilometers away, started well before 8 o'clock advancing towards the forest position. The Germans were the 1st Battalion and the Reconnaissance Battalion of the Das Führer Regiment. This regiment, in turn, was part of the SS Verfundung Division. These were crack troops. They were well trained, they were idealistic, they were almost elite troops, some of the best troops Germany could field at this time. Their main weapons were the infantrymen with their individual weapons and also the MG-34 machine gun. This machine gun was capable of firing 800 rounds a minute. The machine gun's job would have been to put down withering fire on the forest in an effort to keep the boys' heads down. As they reached the village of Tannay behind the camera, things would have started to get a little bit hairy. They would have moved across the field. They would have found perhaps a little ditch or a depression in the field, good places to put their machine guns. Records showed the battle commenced at 8:30 in the morning, when the Germans were about 200 yards away from the edge of the forest. The battle would have started with the machine guns opening up on the forest and the infantry also shooting as well. The infantry would have used a pepper pot technique to slowly move forward, covering each other the whole way in a slow effort to move towards the edge of the forest. Sonny and his gun team would have fired back. Their job would have been to suppress the machine gun nests, as they were causing the most problems in the forest. They didn't always aim directly at the machine gun. One of their techniques was to fire short, kicking up rock, stone, mud, dirt, a sort of shrapnel aerial denial weapon. Records again show that 225 Battery did slow down the advance of the Germans. However, they also show that Sonny was injured fairly quickly after the battle started. He was injured in both the hand and the leg. I don't think this was from direct fire, as he had a big steel plate in front of him to protect him. I think it was more likely to be a ricochet or wood splinters that injured him. The Germans had weight of numbers on their side. They were able to slowly keep moving towards the forest. The machine guns were just unending in the amount of fire they could put down in the forest, and it was pretty overwhelming. Eventually, The Germans moved up towards the edge of the forest, and Sonny and his gun team were forced out of their gun position. They quickly retreated to their truck that they'd placed conveniently the night before, and they were seen to make good their escape out of this position. The Germans, once they'd reached the edge of the forest, then had an even bigger battle at hand. They had to take this forest metre by metre from the British Army. German accounts show that they were mightily impressed by the resistance put up by our guys. There's talk that they were up against elite troops in the forest. Of course they weren't. They were just regular British Army troops. There was one account of infantrymen standing waist deep in a swamp, relentlessly firing at the Germans, refusing to give up the position. The Germans managed to get through a lot of the forest on the 27th of May, but only as far as the main north-south road. It wasn't until the end of the following day that they managed to secure the whole forest. Spending a lot of time here, I can see and understand how the battle evolved. I have no doubt that my great uncle did his part in the battle that took place here. But there comes a time when the odds are so stacked against you, you have to abandon your position, try and save the day, give yourself the chance to try and fight another time, another place, which is exactly what they did. Unfortunately, after leaving this position here, we know Sonny made his escape on a truck. We simply don't know what happened to him after that. I'm here in the Grand Hassad Cemetery. It's in between the towns of Moulbec and Aysbrook. It's about 8 kilometers from the Forest de Nièvre. The interesting thing about this cemetery are the Second World War soldiers that it contains. There's quite a few 5th Royal West Kent infantrymen who of course fought alongside Sonny, and there's also 3 or 4 members of the 57th Anti-Tank Regiment. These are people that would have known Sonny. They may not have been best buddies, but they definitely would have recognized him, and I'm sure spoken to him at some point over the previous few days. The question that I've always wanted to try and figure out is what happened to Sonny in the end. And of course the answer is we'll never know. But there's a few possibilities. Perhaps he was taken prisoner of war. But if that was the case, someone would have recognized him. Someone, when they were released, would have said, oh, here we go, Sonny was with me on the march all the way to XYZ. There should have been Red Cross paperwork generated, but none of that happened. He could have made it to the beaches at Dunkirk, jumped on a boat, only for that boat to have been sunk. But again, someone would have seen him during that journey and would have reported back that he survived to Dunkirk. We know he was injured. Perhaps he was taken to a field dressing station or a hospital. But as soon as you walk into those sort of establishments, your name, rank and number is instantly taken, and that would have been reported back to the British authorities. So unfortunately, the only option is that he was killed. And the British government agreed in the July of 1940, they did issue a notice saying he'd been killed in action. So what I think happened was, after he was last seen getting on his truck and making a successful escape, I think they were probably attacked by a Stuka dive bomber, and that bomb landed on or very close to the vehicle they were in. It came careering off the road, maybe upside down, maybe on fire. People were ejected. It was carnage. I think a few days later, or over the course of the next few days, the bodies of those soldiers were collected up by the locals and they would have been buried. Eventually, they would have been brought to an official cemetery like this. Those that could be identified would have been given a grave marker with their name on it. Those that couldn't be identified would just have a marker with the words "known unto God" on them. I think this is what happened to Sonny. I like to think that actually he's in this cemetery. It's such a good fit. It contains people that he fought alongside, and it contains his friends. I think that he was found. He was given a burial. We just don't know exactly where it is. But this, for me, is his resting place. After the battle, Sonny was awarded the Military Medal for Gallantry. The citation reads, "On the 27th of May, this man was number 3 of a gun sighted at the southwest corner of the Forest de Nièvre. A large column of enemy infantry was seen advancing towards his gun position from about 200 yards range. and Gunner Messenger was immediately wounded in the hand and leg. In spite of his wounds, he remained at his gun and continued firing at the advancing enemy. This had the effect of temporarily silencing the enemy machine guns and held up their advance. When nearly surrounded and forced out of their gun position, Gunner Messenger, together with the whole of his gun crew, withdrew to their vehicles and got away safely. If anyone happens to be in northern France, Sonny is remembered at the Dunkirk Memorial, where his name could be found on column 19, along with the thousands of others who gave their life for king and country.